Welcome. You've joined us today for Report on the Ground, Politics and Geopolitics of Wartime Israel with Haviv Rettig Gur. I'm Ken Bamberger, the Rosalind and Arthur Gilbert Foundation Professor of Law at UC Berkeley and the co-faculty director of the Helen Diller Institute for Jewish Law and Israel Studies. It's been more than a month since October 7th, the Hamas massacre of Israeli civilians and the start of the Israel-Hamas war. And this has been, and it really continues to be, an extremely challenging period for all of us here at the Helen Diller Institute, as it has been for so many on our campus and in our community. As the past week since October 7th have demonstrated, polarization on college campuses is more severe than ever, and it can be challenging for students to find spaces for complex and nuanced thinking and for respectful dialogue. And we're working daily to further that goal. Our staff and our faculty are working intensely on new ways to offer deep support for students, creating daily opportunities for students and staff and faculty to come together. And our public programming has also reflected this goal. I joined Haviv for an emergency meeting in the week of October, after October 7th, a very powerful discussion. We had the writer and psychologist Ayelet Gonder-Goshen, who spoke about her role as an emergency mental health worker, counseling the survivors of the Hamas attack in the South. We had New York Times Jerusalem correspondent Isabel Kirshner, who explored this unprecedented moment in Israeli history and society. Ron Hassner hosted a virtual webinar with Ehud Eran on geopolitics, military strategy, and the Israel-Hamas war. And I mention these all because you can find recordings of each of these events on our website. All these events and all the activities of our institute are supported by our community. We thank you very much for your continued support. And our website and the link to our recorded programs has been put into the chat. Today, we're hosting our third virtual webinar this semester with Haviv Rettig Gur. Haviv is a veteran Israeli journalist who serves as senior analyst for the Times of Israel. He's covered Israel's politics, foreign policy, education system, and relationship with the Jewish diaspora since 2005. He's reported from over 20 countries and served as the communications director for Israel's largest NGO, the Jewish Agency. We're at a moment where in Israel, 200,000 families are displaced, refugees in other part of the country. Missiles continue to fall, not just from Hamas, but in the north from Hezbollah and from the Houthis in Yemen, reaching Eilat in the south. Haviv, in the midst of all this, thanks for joining us. How are you doing, and what's the mood on the ground in Israel?
I'm doing very well. Thank you so much for having me. It's really good to be here. We just had a baby in the family. My brother-in-law is called up. He's at the front in Gaza. He's a paratrooper in the reserves. In his civilian life, he's a high-tech guy. And his wife has been living with us. She's 8 months pregnant. She's, it's been a little bit of a dramatic situation. And anyway, so she's no longer 8 months pregnant. She gave birth 2 days ago, and now everyone's dealing with the baby, and he got a week out. So he's with the baby. And so sort of it's a microcosm of my life, but it's sort of the situation, I think, for all Israelis. We're already in the 6th week or so. And so people we're not moving on at all. We're still profoundly in this moment. There's a war there, there's still 350,000 men called up. We're seeing, we're still learning about October 7th. We're seeing what's happening in Gaza. We're worried for our soldiers. All of that's all very much registering with everybody, but at the same time, the schools have reopened For 2 weeks, the schools were closed. And then they've reopened, but not entirely, only half the week or partially. One of the big problems with reopening schools was that there aren't enough bomb shelter, spec rooms for all students. So we had my kids' school, for example, had a couple of weeks where only half the school came each day. And so, even grades, right? Second, fourth, sixth grades came one day, and then the next day odd grades came. And then all the kids could learn only in the areas of the school that could survive a shelling, a rocket fire, right, from Gaza. So that's no longer the case. The schools are fully open. They just added in the last couple of days, Fridays are back. So all of Israeli society is slowly coming back to itself and learning to live in a kind of routine in the middle of a war with, the entire sort of reserve army called up. So it's life goes on. 2 people were still, were identified from the October 7th massacre just in the last couple of days. There are still bodies being identified that were burned very badly. There's still memories constantly coming up. We're still talking, all those people you mentioned, the 200,000 families who are displaced, that includes hundreds of families who actually went through the massacre. We're still with them. They include some friends of ours, specific people who are friends of ours. So I think we're okay. And I think we're getting back to our routine, finding that routine, hoping the war ends soon. I think that describes the majority of Israelis.
Let me try to ask some questions I've been collecting over the last week that are kind of on the minds of people outside of Israel, as our informant on the ground. Maybe you can help us. A lot of folks are wondering, is there a sense that you're getting in your reporting and your discussions of what an end goal might be, what a victory might be, that kind of the government has embraced?
That's an interesting question. Let me parse it out into 2 different kinds of goals. The first is obvious, clear, universally held by Israelis. I say universally, I don't obviously mean it's unanimous, but it is as close to unanimous as one can imagine. It's a majority of Israeli Arabs, it's a majority of Israeli Jews, and that is the removal, dismantling, demolition of Hamas. Hamas as an organization. Hamas has a fighting force of roughly 40,000 men. It has institutions, it has bank accounts, it has activist organizations and agencies in Gaza. That is going to be dismantled. And if that takes months, then that's how long it's going to take. Any government that tries to stop that process will be replaced by the Israeli public, by a government that won't stop that process. So there's a very clear goal, and that goal is the threat on our border that is no longer tolerable must be removed. And there is infinite political capital to the government for getting that done. And then there's the question that maybe is what you were imagining and everyone's imagining, everyone's thinking, and especially the Biden administration has told us it's desperately wants answers on, which is what happens the day after. And the simple answer, as far as I can tell, is that nobody has the faintest idea what happens the day after. The problem of Hamas is larger than the organization, even if you understand the organization as expansively as I just described. The problem with Hamas is that it is a vision of Israel. It is an understanding and interpretation of the Jewish enemy that is shared far beyond the bounds of Hamas's own institutional boundaries. It is the part of Palestinian politics, which is probably a majority of Palestinian politics, or a majority of certainly the ideological elites of the Palestinian society, that sees the conflict with the Israelis as part of a larger sort of cosmic Islamic return into history, as an agent of history, or it sees it as this very large, broad sort of decolonization process, which is the entire Arab world is invested in some way or another. The idea that terrorism is necessary and must be maintained and sustained permanently, and that the only path to liberation, or any liberation worth having, the two-state solution is a surrender to evil, and the only way to actually have a liberation with having that idea isn't going anywhere. It might weaken. It might weaken for a generation, just because of the scale of the disaster that Hamas now represents for the Palestinian cause, at least on the ground in Gaza, certainly. But we don't yet know the fallout from this war, the political, the international, the local. What comes after Hamas in Palestinian politics could very well simply be another version of the same thing, as long as the narrative remains. And so the question a lot of Israelis are asking is, what do we do the day after? Does the Palestinian Authority, which sees it as one of its primary functions to support the so-called pay-for-slay policy, which is to support with welfare checks the families and the actual terrorists who have murdered Jews, right? Who have carried out these terror attacks in the framework of this decolonization narrative. That Palestinian Authority policy of paying essentially a salary to Palestinian terrorists, it's not just a salary. The Palestinian Authority has a pay scale that depends on your prison sentence. And so if you get a 3-year prison sentence because it was a minor attack, you have a very low monthly payment. But if you get a 25-year or a lifetime prison sentence because it was mass murder, then your monthly payment is actually quite high. It's actually a livable salary. And so the Palestinian Authority's payment scheme almost incentivizes terrorism. The point here isn't to criticize the Palestinian Authority for it, although I do criticize it for it, but the point is that why would they do this? Why would the Palestinian Authority, which is deeply invested under Mahmoud Abbas in calm, which works closely with Israeli security services to maintain that calm in the West Bank and has done so for 15 years, why would it support financially and spend a double-digit percentage of aid the Palestinian Authority gets and tax funding the Palestinian Authority gets? Just to understand the scale of these payments, it's hundreds of millions of shekels. Why would they invest that? And the answer is that they themselves are invested in the basic foundational narrative that this is an anti-colonial conflict and that terrorism doesn't work, but if it did work, really would be a great idea. And it's a shame it doesn't work because we do need, that would be the ideal. There's this kind of complicated relationship between the parts of Palestinian society that are moderate and want to work with the Israelis, but can't give up the basic story of the Israelis being this colonialist evil that has to be removed. And so if all of that was a long way of saying, if the Palestinian Authority is brought into the Gaza Strip, which is what a lot of the center left wants to see in Israeli politics, I think Benny Gantz, certainly the Biden administration, a lot of Israelis are asking, well, why wouldn't that pan out exactly like Yasser Arafat panned out? In other words, eventually it would simply be it doesn't have another narrative. It doesn't have a story of the Israelis in which the Israelis are legitimate, and therefore we invest in a future together of coexistence and peace. And so we don't know what that looks like. Netanyahu has said only that there will be some kind of long-term Israeli security control. Well, is that occupation? Under a Netanyahu government, which is utterly dependent for its survival as a coalition in this parliament on the far right and on the religious right and on the settlement movement, does that mean Netanyahu will prevent settlers from reestablishing settlements in the West Bank under an Israeli military rule of the West Bank? And nobody knows what any of these things mean. Netanyahu isn't saying it with any clarity, and the center left isn't saying with any clarity. I saw one Israeli politician say, people with Israeli opposition to the PA taking over in Gaza is silly. He said, I, of course, would love it if Denmark would agree to run Gaza for a while and turn it into a version, a Denmark in the Middle East, but it's not going to happen. And so what options have we got, right? If not Denmark, probably the Palestinian Authority is our best option. But that kind of Hebrew language discourse is what's happening. No Israeli has any idea what happens after. At the moment, no Israeli cares. In other words, at the moment, the goal is, it's a little bit like probably the American discourse over Japan or Nazi Germany in World War II. The first priority is to eliminate the threat. and nobody really has any clear understanding of the horizon that comes after.
What about the hostages and the hostage families and the issue of hostage return? I mean, there are now almost nightly demonstrations by hostage families, pushing, I don't know what direction that pushes, but it does show the bind that Israel is in trying to figure out how to balance getting rid of Hamas, getting hostages home. Do those align? Do they not? Where is that in the Israeli discourse?
I'm going to say something I don't think any Israeli politician would dare say, but I think is the truth. The Israeli war planning has concluded that because the hostages are, because the problem is so great, because the Israeli sort of strategic planning class has concluded that the vast costs that Israel has been willing to pay in the past for hostages created this hostage problem. And if we don't lower that cost and raise the cost for kidnapping, in other words, lower what we're willing to pay for a hostage and raise the cost for kidnapping, we're creating new hostage problems going forward. New and even larger than this absolute agony. I think there are 34 children currently held by Hamas in the dungeons and bunkers and tunnels under Gaza right now.
And I know you spoke with us last time you were here about a family who is like family to you, who I think lost 11 members either to murder or
three have since been found dead. 2 we still don't know. 6 are confirmed in Gaza, including 4-year-old girl Yahel and an 8-year-old boy. And that's the Haran family of Kibbutz Be'eri. And it makes saying what I'm going to say right now even more painful. But my sense is from the Israeli, again, military planning sort of elite discourse is that the operation has to remain relentless. The operation has to be sustained. Hamas can't be allowed to regroup. Hamas has one massive advantage. It literally got to build the battlefield. And it got to create the tunnel system. It got to force the Israelis to reach through Palestinian civilians to get to Hamas, which has massive costs. We're not talking morality here for a second. We're just talking clean, cold strategy without any moral or even political considerations. It forces Israel to cut through the civilian populations to get to Hamas and to fight in places where Israel's superiority in numbers and equipment and training are not useful to Israel, which is to say in the tunnels. Hamas built that battlefield, and the Israeli response over the last month is to try and rebuild it in return. So the Israelis have surrounded Gaza City, the largest city in the Gaza Strip. Roughly half the Gaza Strip essentially is Gaza City, have surrounded it and have destroyed well over 300 tunnel exits. As they advance, they find and destroy these tunnel exits. There are dogs, there are robots, there are all these, whole engineering core units that have been training to deal with these tunnels. And by slowly closing the circle around Gaza City and we're already fairly deep into Gaza City at this point, it has rebuilt the battlefield in return, in which Hamas is now underground with very few, increasingly few ways to get above ground, at least in the northern half of Gaza. And that's how it's forcing Hamas up into the air, or at least forcing Hamas to navigate a much smaller section of its tunnels. Hamas has failed so far to produce any serious response. It appears as though Hamas's actual command and control broke down fairly quickly after the Israelis moved in, because Israel has just managed that conflict very, very well. Long story short, it's all about sustaining the pressure and preventing Hamas from finding ways to finding Israeli weak points, rebuilding the command and control networks underground with its various units and brigades. If you give a 3-day, right now there's talk about 50 hostages for a 3-day ceasefire. That 3-day ceasefire will kill soldiers. That 3-day ceasefire will mean an Israeli response to Hamas's operations that it will invest those 3 days in building and developing, that will also kill Palestinian civilians. That 3-day ceasefire will loosen the pressure, will ease the pressure on Hamas. And in the end, may very well not release hostages, because even if we do get 50 for 3 days, there's another 190 who will be more easily moved around, who will be, easier to hide from us because of the release of that pressure. And so we have heard from Defense Minister Gallant, we have heard from others that nothing, possibly except a massive hostage release, will give Hamas a ceasefire and stop the Israeli, the steady, implacable Israeli movement into Gaza City. I take from everything I just said and my understanding of what Israeli strategic planners are thinking, the very sad conclusion that there are so many hostages, and hostages have become so expensive, so valuable to the enemy, that the Israeli war effort cannot place the release of the hostages as its top priority, or even as its second highest priority. The first priority has to be exacting a cost that saves future hostages. Gallant has expressed this in a very smart way, I think a very politically sort of palatable way, and I think he also believes this. He said, the hostages that we will rescue by sustained pressure, by Hamas's desperation. That will release hostages in a way that negotiation won't. And in fact, if hostages are worth a 3-day ceasefire, more hostages will remain existentially valuable to an organization like Hamas. So there's a tension here. Netanyahu may overrule that because the hostage families have now built a campaign that really has seen marches through the streets of Jerusalem, right? We've seen that. And so there might be a political class overruling of that military concept of how to deal with it. But I think that certainly the defense minister and the army would like to press forward without the hostages being something that stops the army.
Again, this is against the background of the history in which the last hostage swap, which involved 1,000 prisoners being released by Israel, included a large group who ended up being the coordinators of this attack. Is that
Yahya Sinwar, the military commander of Hamas and the mastermind of the October 7th attack, and a man who had committed mass murder, was released by mass murder beforehand, right? Previously. That's what he was in prison for. Was released in the 2011 Shalit deal, where we gave 1,100 people, including mass murderers, for one soldier.
You also mentioned Netanyahu, and I want to mention 2 polls and ask how you understand them. The first poll is a poll by the Israel Democracy Institute in the last couple of days, which showed that very high percentages of Israelis feel an identity with the state, unity with the state. And interestingly, that includes not just Jewish Israelis, but also Palestinian Arab Israelis, to the tune of 70, 80, 90%. That's on one side. On the other side is a poll that says that only 4% of Israelis believe that Netanyahu is a reliable source of information about the war, which I have to say resonates a lot with, I think, some of the concerns of the American Jewish community in terms of who's articulating the view and vision of the Israeli government in a way that's coherent and that can be understood and digested by, I guess, domestic and foreign audiences. So how do you explain that? How does that play out? Ultimately, maybe you can talk a little bit about the first, about this tremendous sense of unity, and then also about this kind of dissonance with where's Netanyahu in all of this, and he's writing tweets at Trump-like tweets at 1 a.m, criticizing others. I know he's been criticized for not visiting any of the families of the hostages until just a couple of days ago. He's not doing the Biden empathy thing, certainly. Where does this unity come from, and what's with Netanyahu as a leader?
Yeah, two great questions. The unity thing has been astonishing. Arab Israelis, as a general statement, what we know from a lot of polls, a lot of qualitative research, a lot of Arab Israeli voices, is that Arab Israelis live a fascinating, layered, liminal existence. They are Palestinians. They are Israelis. They are Arab as opposed to Jewish. They are Muslim by the large majority. There is a meaningful and growing Christian Arab community in Israel, but nevertheless, the large majority are Muslim. And all of these identities interact in all these very interesting ways. And when you poll them about these different identities, you get fascinating responses that also match up with their electoral behaviors. Where you ask them, for example, one of my favorite polls are polls conducted by Israel Democracy Institute, a think tank, a few years back, where they asked Israeli Arabs, please rank your identities for us. In other words, what's your top identity? What do you identify with most? And give us that ranking of, let's say, Arab, Palestinian, Muslim, and Israeli. And you got about a quarter for each, was the fascinating finding. A quarter of Israel's Arab community said we're Israelis first, and all the other things in whatever different order we are last, right? We're after that. And then about a quarter said we're Palestinian first, and a quarter said we're Muslim first. Now, these correspond more than, quite a bit, not perfectly, but they correspond quite a bit to political parties. So the Islamic Ram party is the party to which people vote if they tend to put Islamic at the higher rank of that on polls like that. And Hadash, Hadash is a progressive, former communist, now very, social democrat, I think they call themselves, very, very progressive, post-nationalist kind of party. And they sometimes, the actual larger Arab as opposed to Palestinian, or tends to be how they prioritize themselves. And they supported Assad, for example, as a political party in the Syrian civil war. There's a kind of pan-Arabist view. And then there's Balad, a Palestinian nationalist party in Israel, where if you put Palestinian at the top, you tend to vote for them. So we have this fascinating, layered, complex, by the way, I hope it's clear, people move between those, right? In other words, events shape how they prioritize those many layers of identity, and that to me is very fascinating, because that's of course how normal humans live in these complicated kinds of places. The Hamas assault, the massacre of October 7th, rejiggered those identities, and we had, for example, probably the single most well-known, most popular Arab Israeli online influencer. Forgive me, I'm 42. I come by these terms. I grew up with the internet. I'm just young enough for that. But influencers, TikTok influencers, still a little bit distant from me. But nevertheless, his name is Nas, and he's very, very popular. He has millions of followers all over the world. He's very popular among Arab Israelis, and he actually posted, and he never talks politics. And he posted, unsolicited by anybody, it wasn't part of any discussion with anybody online. He posted a statement in which he said, I have always been Israeli and I have always been Palestinian, and Palestinian came first. And now Israeli comes first. And it was a fascinating statement by a fascinating person, and people should look it up, because I'm not going to do it justice here, sort of remembering it, right? But he wasn't giving up one iota of his Palestinian identity. And he refuses to give up one iota of his Israeli identity. And he refuses the very notion that these are mutually exclusive in any way. But he said, but it was essentially a response to what that massacre represents in terms of Palestinian politics. This is the behavior of the single most popular political party in the Palestinian political world. And I don't want to live there. I don't want to be that. I feel deeply Israeli, right? That sense that wherever you ranked Israeli in those rankings of your layers of your identity, that ranking was bumped up one, right? If it was fourth, then it's third. If it was second, then it's first. That sense we are hearing in 1,000 different ways throughout the Arab community. Really throughout. There have been voices, the Arab journalists, Arab officials, politicians that have been just profoundly seeking integration into the Israeli experience, into the Israeli trauma, wanting to be part of it. Arab Israelis were massacred by Hamas as well, not in their hundreds and hundreds like the Jews, but in their dozens. It wasn't one accidental killing. There is a campaign in the Bedouin city of Rahat in the south, bring our people home, and they have faces, and they include women, and they include children, and there is one family, large family in the Bedouin sense, a very large clan, that offered $1 million ransom, is that the word, for any information leading to the specific members of Hamas who killed a specific member of their clan. And they have a blood debt. and they publicized it. So there is a sense of integration that's profound. We've seen time after time Arab Israelis opening their homes to some of these displaced families, Arab Israelis cooking for these soldiers, Arab Israelis taking pride in the Bedouin military units. Bedouin communities have asked that their soldiers serve, sometimes they ask that their soldiers serve together. And so we actually have a Bedouin battalion in the Israeli infantry. And as these soldiers were being taken by helicopter to the Gaza front, I think it was on October 10th, they put out music videos of themselves telling Hamas, we're coming. And it was all Arabic. And it was a Bedouin Arabic music video posted to Twitter by Bedouin soldiers out to get revenge against Hamas, Arabic to Arabic audience. But they're wearing Israeli military uniforms, right? And heading into war as an Israeli battalion. And so there's been this sense of shared fate, a sense of integration that there wasn't before. You have to mention, Ra'am, the political party, its leader Mansour Abbas has talked about integration, has made integration the centerpiece of his campaign over the last 3 or 4 years, and has essentially become the largest political party in the Arab Israeli community with that campaign. And over the last month, he's doubled down on that. And as we see the scenes from Gaza and the civilian death toll from Gaza, and the completely, a lot of the criticism of Israel about what's happening in Gaza, I believe is just completely unjust and unfair and unserious, and a reinvention of international law specifically for us. And a lot of it isn't. There's a massive death toll in Gaza. I would like to know that the Israelis are doing it right, that there's serious legal and ethical people sitting in the control rooms deciding where to bomb and what to bomb. I am not convinced that that is always the case. I think the world is hypocritical. The international community only barely exists. Certainly if you're a small people that needs defending, I don't know of an example of a small people ever being defended by the international community, but that doesn't mean I'm exonerated from my own ethical requirements. And so I think there is a lot of space for criticizing Israel. I would like to have an honest critique of the Israeli war effort, and it's hard to find outside our borders because so much of it is such a moral panic rather than a serious critique, including in the organizations that we rely on to tell us that these things are moral, like Human Rights Watch or Amnesty, which which have said silly things that they have in the past said the opposite. Like, for example, bombing a hospital is legitimate if that hospital is being used as a military base. That is something that Human Rights Watch has always upheld and said outright publicly when America bombed a hospital in Mosul or in Baghdad or in Afghanistan. And now it's ipso facto not, because the Israeli war effort in principle is illegitimate. So it hasn't been a discussion of ethics in international law, unfortunately, and I wish it was. But instead of taking that critical stance, that legitimate, serious critical stance, Mansour Abbas has even responded to those scenes from Gaza by telling Israelis, we have to do what we can to reduce the death toll in Gaza among civilians. But we are Israelis, and we're part of the Israeli tragedy. And we are here to be part of the Israeli story. And then, we also have to give the Palestinians their aspirations and their dignity and all of that. I'll stop there, but just to say, this is an immense story and profound, and the change is real, felt everywhere. I don't know that there's going back from this. There's a deeper integration that this has brought about in Israeli society.
I want to come back to the critique, but first I want to say if on all fronts there is this deep rallying and identity, how does Netanyahu fit in? Part of the mistrust that people have that I think decisions are being made in the most ethical way, or that there is a coherence, or that decisions are being made with certain goals in mind are undermined by these results that say nobody trusts him. Why, usually a leader gets some boost from some kind of nationalizing event. What's going on with Netanyahu?
I try and stay above the fray in the sense that I'd like to be able to say things that a very strong supporter of Netanyahu can hear, as well as a very strong critic of Netanyahu can hear. But I think that what we have seen in terms of Netanyahu's functioning since the start of the war is in some very just undeniable, unavoidable ways. A prime minister who kind of understands that he's collapsing. His political position has essentially collapsed. What's left to him is to finish the war, if only to not trigger a political crisis in the middle of a war. And he is not going to survive this. But he's already begun to build a campaign. I'll give you an example of Netanyahu's political collapse. He hasn't given an interview in which journalists have been allowed to ask him questions since 2021. He hasn't given an interview since the beginning of the war in which journalists are allowed to ask questions. So much so that he has, Benny Gantz is this centrist leader of a political party from the opposition who agreed to join the government just for the purposes of managing the war in a special 5-person war cabinet that would take the decision-making away from the larger cabinet that includes the far right, elements of the government and all of that. And Benny Gantz has had a few press conferences to tell the Israeli public what's going on in the war. And the defense minister had a press conference, and Netanyahu was always invited to all these press conferences. And Netanyahu's office has refused, because whenever Benny Gantz is standing at the podium, he takes questions from journalists. Whenever the defense minister stands at a podium, Yoav Gallant, he takes questions from journalists. And Netanyahu has been unwilling to do that. Well, that changed. That changed a few days ago. I believe it was 3-4 days ago. Netanyahu gave a press conference. And because of the criticism, of the intense criticism, and because the criticism seeped into the Likud base, where the Likud base says it's a war. How dare you still be playing those very defensive kinds of politics in the middle of a war? Let people ask you questions. And so Netanyahu did. And over the course of the questions that he was asked, it became clear that he had actually planted quite a few questions. So it was a very pro-Netanyahu journalist who said to him, "What about your sons? Are your sons serving in the military?" And he said, "One son was called up and another one is working on the public diplomacy avenue from, Miami, where he's living." And it was the only question in the press conference that he read from a piece of paper. In other words, he knew it was coming, and it was a very pro-Netanyahu journalist who asked it. And so Netanyahu has been desperate to manage the message, and we have seen, Channel 14 is this essentially the Israeli Fox News, but more so. In other words, Fox News has different voices.
I would say Newsmax.
I think it's news. In fact, I think it really draws inspiration and models itself graphically on that sort of Newsmax kind of American model and space. And what's been fascinating, by the way, Netanyahu has given them interviews where they're allowed to ask questions. All of their questions have been about how great he is. I wish that didn't sound so partisan, but it's just literally so. But what's been fascinating is that even there, the criticism has started to seep in. You have had really, virulent criticism of Netanyahu in a newspaper called Israel-Hayom, which is one of the largest newspapers in Israel and was created to support Netanyahu's campaign by the Adelson family a few years back, about, 10, 15 years back. And there have been op-eds in that newspaper, and not just op-eds, editorials from the heads of the newspaper, very critical of the politicking that's been going on in Likud since the beginning of the war. You've had both political campaigns and also anger at political campaigns within this right-wing ecosystem, that while the whole country has set aside the politics, all the protesters against the judicial reform have gone to serve. All the civil society organizations that would organize these protests against the government pivoted instantly to organize the home front, to organize help for families, to organize support for soldiers. And the center left has, Benny Gantz has come into the government to stabilize the politics so that you can fight the enemy. And all of that's been happening on one side. And a lot of the Likud and right-wing institutions are still in campaign mode and still, finding enemies on the left and all of this. So Netanyahu has been tremendously criticized. He has been avoiding serious questioning by journalists or in public in any way. We've had this famous, of course, avoidance of accepting responsibility. The chief of staff of the Israeli army said, "This happened on my watch. I'm responsible. We misunderstood the enemy, and this is my fault." And then the head of army intelligence said exactly that. And then the head of the Shabak, the domestic intelligence agency, said exactly that. And then the defense minister said, "No, this is they're all arguing, it's all their fault." And the only one who's absolutely not arguing that has been Netanyahu. And there have been multiple political cartoonists that published the same cartoon in a slightly different version, in which they line all these people up, and the chief of staff says, "It's my fault," and this guy says, "It's my fault, it's my fault, it's my fault." And Netanyahu says, "Yeah, I agree with all of them." It's everybody's right. And because that's the Israeli discourse, why won't he accept responsibility? Netanyahu has defended this idea that Hamas is deterred, this idea that we can buy them off with Qatari money, this idea that we are safer with this, limited military campaigns on occasion and just essentially funding them to stabilize them. Netanyahu has defended that policy for 15 years. He has spearheaded that policy. It is his policy more than anyone else's, and he will not accept responsibility. And that discourse has reached the American media. He has given more interviews. He's given exactly one to the Israeli press since the start of the war, where journalists could ask questions, and he's given, a dozen to the American press, right, to the CNN, to different American news channels and newspapers. And so Netanyahu is asked by them. He goes on CNN, and CNN says to him, "Can you tell us you accept responsibility?" And he's avoided it at all costs. And he said that this isn't the time for that, or, everyone has responsibility for something. We're going to talk about it after the war. And so he's a man who's still campaigning. We have a poll from yesterday that tells us half of Likud voters won't vote for him again. But he's still campaigning. And I think that more than any of the good he's done over the years, he's been a pretty responsible steward of the Israeli economy. He's been in many ways, people like to compare him to Trump during the Trump years. But if you look at the Israeli COVID response, which he masterminded and organized, this was no Trump. This was a very competent, very thoughtful, very learned leader who dabbles and even sometimes really sinks into populist politics. But that will not be his legacy. But his legacy will be what we've seen, I think, since October 7th.
Lots of follow-up questions on other images that we're seeing a lot of, also having to do with the right, which may be considered politicking, but an interview in this week's New Yorker with Daniela Weiss, a settler leader, and statements by right-wing ministers of far-flung ministries, but saying maybe we should nuke Gaza, or this is the time to reoccupy, and scattered shots of soldiers with signs saying this is our goal, is to occupy and resettle. What are we to make of those?
Daniela Weiss was very clear about her views. In a sense, every Israeli who speaks represents, Israelis are pretty blunt, they're not, it's extremely hard for Israel to produce good propaganda, good public diplomacy. We literally have founded the Hasbara ministry. Hasbara is a word that in English has taken on a life of its own. In Hebrew, it just means explaining or public diplomacy or uncharitably propaganda. We founded that ministry 5 times and closed it 5 times. And nobody quite ever knew what it means, what Hasbara is. There is an Israeli, not a disdain, but a real sense of not liking, not wanting to justify ourselves to the nations of the world, right? Perhaps the heart of Zionism is the idea that the world's not going to be there to save you. You don't explain yourself to the world. You don't justify yourself. You do what you need to do. And so Israelis are culturally, in their DNA, you go back to the founders of the Zionist movement in the 1880s, you will see this. They believe that the whole idea that we need to explain our position to the world is suspicious, is suspect, it's unhealthy, and it's not something we need to be obsessed with. And so we keep founding a Hasbara ministry and then shutting it down and not being able to really rally the whole country around a single message, to the point where we just had a Hasbara minister, a member of Likud, and as soon as the war started, she looked around and said, well, wasting public money in peacetime is for my political career is fine, but it's just not okay to waste public money in wartime. So she quit and shut down her ministry. And so in the name of ethical good governance, the Israeli government shut down its public diplomacy ministry at the start of a war, which tells you how little Israelis really understand what this is. Israel has always spoken in many, many voices. We're not going to fix it. It will always say whatever its enemies wanted to say. There will always be one Israeli or 15 Israelis or 10% of Israeli society that will say horrifying, stupid things. Amichai Eliyahu, the minister from the extreme right Otzma Yehudit party, it's literally the farthest right party you can get in Israel. There's simply no one left to the right of it. Amichai Eliyahu was in a radio interview a couple of weeks ago, and the interviewer was a little struck by the bellicosity of his comments about Gaza. And then he said, so what, we nuke them? And then Amichai Eliyahu, with a perfect straight face, said, well, perfect, straight tone, it was on the radio, said that is an option, just like that. There are so many ways that that's blitheringly stupid. For one thing, he's the minister of tradition. Minister of tradition is a new ministry invented out of whole cloth to give the Otzma Yehudit party another ministry. It's not a real ministry. It doesn't do anything real. He doesn't decide. Nobody listens to him. He doesn't matter. He's a clown in a clownish party on the edges of Israeli politics and represents nobody. Also, he doesn't know if Israel has a nuke any more than I do, because if he did know, then he just admitted it. And that's a crime. That's a violation of the censorship on one of the very few issues where it's actually enforced. It's so unbelievably stupid, right? And yet he said it. Now, I explained to Israelis, said, look, if anybody around the world thinks Amichai Eliyahu saying we're going to nuke Gaza, represents the Israeli position, then they're too stupid to talk to. And my response to them has been, Israelis speak Hebrew and are convinced the whole world is hearing them. If I were to, hear critics in the West, if I am a critic in the West of the Chinese treatment of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang, which I happen to be, and there's a claim that this is genocide, and the Chinese government said, it's definitely not genocide, how dare you? And then one member of the security cabinet of the Chinese government comes out and says, no, it's genocide. We're gonna murder every last one of them. We don't have concentration camps there by accident, right? I'm going to believe that guy. And if the Chinese, media then says to me, you believe that guy? He's a clown. Everybody knows he's a clown. Don't believe that guy. I'm not going to trust that. I'm going to believe that guy. I try to explain this to Israelis. Amichai Eliyahu caused terrible damage. And Israelis literally found out this guy exists that day. In other words, this is a backbencher no one's ever heard of.
Let me ask.
Let
me ask. I'm getting a lot of questions about maybe some more concrete stuff, including the increase in settler violence in the West Bank and Ben Gvir's kind of sotto voce distribution of guns to various kind of National Guard units that are kind of happening along. How are Israelis thinking about that? What are they feeling about that?
That's a good follow-up.
Kind of, everybody's looking the other way. Yeah.
It's a good challenge to what I just said. I don't mean to suggest that these people are idiots and therefore don't listen to them. They're absolutely serious in their beliefs, and their beliefs are extreme. In the Netanyahu government, this extremist party has 5 seats. Netanyahu has a 4-seat majority above he has 64 seats. He needs 61 to win a confidence vote in parliament. They have him by the throat. I think that's the respectable way to say that. And so the most extreme party in Israeli politics, whose leaders have said things like, well, yeah, maybe we should nuke Gaza, and have defended the Jewish terrorism in the West Bank that we believe is spiking. It's hard to get numbers right now. The police, under the leadership of the minister of the police, who is the head of the Otzma Yehudit party, has released statistics that we don't understand that seem to show a dramatic decline in Jewish terrorism in the West Bank from last year. That is not the Palestinian experience that we're hearing. My newspaper publishes in 5 languages, including Hebrew, English, Arabic, Persian, and French. We have Palestinian staff and in the West Bank. And the lived experience of Palestinians is that this kind of violence is up. Israel is deeply distracted. In other words, the lack of cracking down on it. Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, has actually spoken against it. In other words, there has been a statement, this is a bad thing. The Shabak has come out publicly and said there are these terror attacks by Israelis. They actually are a security risk to the state of Israel because igniting the West Bank is a new front while we're facing Hezbollah in the north and Hamas in Gaza. So the Israeli mainstream leadership has said this is a problem. The police, for some reason, statistics don't show it. And I suspect that that's a political intervention by Ben Gvir, by the minister. Long story short, everything I said about Israeli Arab identification. Over the last month, we have seen multiple times warnings from the Otzma Yehudit party, including from the Minister of Police, that we're going to see another version of the 2021 riots in mixed cities where Arabs and Jews in significant numbers live together, where we saw real violence in the streets in May 2021. And he warned that that's going to happen and urged Israelis to go get guns. And not only has that not happened, Israeli Arabs have dramatically turned their backs on Hamas. But he keeps warning that it's going to happen. In other words, he wants it to happen. He has an ideology that sees that kind of violence as not a bad thing. So there is a danger, and it's a real danger, and it's not a danger that's going away. And Netanyahu's politics depend on him, and Netanyahu has refused to fire him and Bezalel Smotrich's Religious Zionism Party, which wants openly to reestablish settlements in Gaza, has said so publicly. Netanyahu has refused to jettison them from his coalition and establish a centrist mainstream coalition with the center left, and only been willing to have this 5-member cabinet because he's thinking of the day after. And the day after, the far right will stick with him because it has no other choice. And the center or center left, of course, is going to abandon him and run against him. So, yes, this is a danger. There is a spike in this violence. There are elements of Israeli politics. I can't tell you if it's 5% or 15%. I sure don't think and hope it's not 25%. I don't think polls show that anywhere, any poll I've ever seen. But it is a real number. And it is enough for Netanyahu's future, political future, and Netanyahu to believe that his political future is dependent on it, defends the violence in the West Bank, and talks openly about settlements in Gaza. The mainstream of Israeli Jews in Israel are so horrified by the prospect of reestablishing that kind of relationship in Gaza that I can't imagine. I mean, if, I don't know Israel if that's a thing that actually happens after this war. But those political forces are there. I think that the basic role they have been serving so far is to hurt the war effort, and to ensure that our political friends, the Biden administration, the presidents of France, the Prime Minister of Britain, pay a price for their support for Israel that they didn't need to pay. I blame Netanyahu and his politics for that fact. The Biden administration have done for us things that I didn't think they would, and I can't imagine a future administration doing. They really want Hamas to be removed from Gaza. They would like us to do that job. They've been backing us up for it and holding the Iranians at bay for it. And they feel, I think absolutely rightly, that the Israeli response has been to confirm with these Amichai Eliyahu type and Daniela Weiss type rhetoric, all of the criticism of the Biden administration from the American progressive anti-Israel left. So it's damaging, it's harmful. All the criticism is our fault, and I don't mean to but as a society, an Israeli government is a coalition. An Israeli government has never spoken with one voice. It always has 15 voices, and that's true of Israeli society writ large. There will always be an Israeli saying something that's harmful to what the majority want.
The other set of images that are constant and are the images of Gaza and the images of destroyed neighborhoods and thousands. We know people think it's certainly thousands, many thousands, if not 10,000, which is what Hamas is saying, of people being killed inside Gaza. Large number, neighborhoods destroyed. It's certainly something hard for Americans to see. It certainly creates an additional set of pressures on all of those governments that have supported Israel. What's the sense in Israel seeing these things come in?
It's very layered. Every response you can imagine is happening all at once. There is an awareness that it is happening. I think it is less the lead story in a way that it is in the rest of the world. That's, I think, very natural. When the Americans invaded Iraq, the toll on the Iraqi civilians wasn't the lead story. It was, page 2. I'm not saying that's a good thing. It's just a very natural thing. It's true of any country that goes to war. We are very worried about our soldiers, and we're also aware and worried about the civilians. Israelis are aware, the general public, that the civilian death toll has a strategic significance for the war. In other words, the absolute determination to destroy Hamas also kind of depends on a political window. And at some point, the American administration will say, we can't support this anymore. We're paying too high a price. I'm not going to lose Michigan in the next election in a year because I supported Israel now. Joe Biden might say to himself, I mean, of course, the very large Arab and Muslim community in Michigan, which votes and which has turned dramatically against the Biden administration in the immediate, over the last really 3 weeks. And might come back. In other words, I don't think they're turning Republican, and so, but nevertheless, these political considerations are there. They're real. If that political window closes, that doesn't mean Israel's going to stop, but it means it's going to be more expensive. The shipments of specific weapons that we use are going to stop from the American administration. The support against Iran, or at least Iran's perception that America's backing Israel, might be reduced. The timetable might be moved up, right? At some point, some Israeli commander on the ground might get the message from the prime minister that, whatever you don't get in the next 3 weeks, we're not going to get, because the international cost for us is rising, and at some point it's not going to be worth it. And then the Israeli operation has to kick into high gear. Ironically, the pressure for Israel to stop sooner is probably going to massively increase the death toll, because it will be able to be much less exact. I caution people, you were right to talk about numbers very cautiously. The only numbers we have are Hamas's numbers. There simply aren't any other numbers. Nobody's going to produce numbers that Hamas doesn't approve. And there's some miracles in those numbers. For example, 0 Hamas fighters have been killed since in the Israeli ground assault, which is hard to believe, given that there are a lot of Hamas fighters in the places where Israel's military has fought in Gaza. And so the numbers themselves need to be taken with a grain of salt, but there is no question. But it's the basic moral question and the basic political question isn't different if there are 1,800 dead children or 3,100 dead children. I mean, each child is a world, and the basic moral question remains, right? So take the numbers cautiously, but the basic question that Israelis need to answer is, how do they understand the death of innocents? I think the simple answer is, Israelis believe Hamas is out to destroy their children, just to literally murder their children. Hamas convinced them of that by murdering their children. And therefore, Hamas must be destroyed for the safety of our children. And if that's true, then the fact that Hamas, its entire survival strategy, literally it's one strategy now. It built the battlefield for no other reason, with no other intent than to place itself underneath the civilians and force the Israelis to go through the civilians to get to it, believing that that will exact too high a price and eventually prevent the Israelis from actually getting and destroying Hamas. It believes that the transformation of the entirety of Gaza's civilian population into one vast human shield will make it effectively invincible. And it is now axiomatic to the vast, vast majority of the Israeli public that Hamas cannot be allowed to be invincible. And so there was to our vision of this war, and I think this is genuinely what is felt by ordinary people watching the images coming out of Gaza. We complain that the world is hypocritical. The Americans killed tens of thousands of civilians in Mosul in 2016. Nobody spoke. Nobody marched anywhere. So you're all a bunch of hypocrites, you people around the world. That complaint I happen to share, and I happen to think is absolutely correct. It just doesn't save me from the problem, because there's still thousands of dead children. And so I think that the Israeli answer is that Hamas committed two crimes against humanity. The first crime it committed against us, and the second crime it committed against Gazan civilians, because it is forcing us, as its foundational strategy, to go through them to get to it. I am extremely open to a specific criticism of a specific airstrike. I am, there's the Israeli military at this particular moment is something like 700,000 fighters, 700,000 people, fighters and logistics and all the different pieces of the Israeli army. The official number is, by the way, not public, secret, but basically we know 360,000 have been called up. We know there's a standing army. Basically, it's about 700,000 people. You want to tell me that in those 700,000 people, some of them are trigger happy? You want to tell me there's a criminal among them? I'm going to believe you. If there's an American audience, and I'm going to tell that American audience, you guys know that America makes mistakes and sometimes commits crime. I mean, no American I've ever met has fallen off a chair being told America does something wrong. I'm completely open to that suggestion. When the Israeli Air Force bombed Jabalia and the street caved in because there was a tunnel complex underneath it, and so the street itself caved in and 2 buildings fell in from the street caving in, and the first reports, again, by Hamas, talked about 400 dead, and Israel had no answer to that for 3 hours. I was open to the idea that this was a misjudgment. B, if it wasn't a misjudgment, it might have been a war crime. The first thing that we heard from the Israeli army was there was a Hamas commander in Jabalia at the time. Well, if the death toll is anywhere near what Hamas claimed, and this was to chase down one Hamas commander, that isn't proportional by any standard, even the most hawkish standard. And Israel is a signatory to 4th Geneva. In other words, that international laws of war, the laws of armed conflict, are Israeli law as well, because it is a signatory. It turned out that in Jabalia, there was, in fact, about 20 Hamas fighters killed out of a death toll that maybe hit 50, which is absolutely proportional and is reasonable in that kind of urban setting conflict, and that the buildings falling was a result of Hamas literally building all its infrastructures, legitimate military targets underneath those buildings. I have a Human Rights Watch report from a different conflict in a different place that said that a hospital becomes a target, a legitimate legal target, when it is used for military operations. And Human Rights Watch has reported on us today or yesterday, put out a statement that it is absolutely a war crime. By the way, declaring it, not even saying it needs to be investigated, declaring it a war crime that Israel's operating in Shifa Hospital. Long story short, I think that the Israeli belief, we haven't yet seen something that fundamentally alters the view among the ordinary Israeli public that Hamas put them in the way, and that we have the right to not let Hamas be invincible because those civilians are in the way. We don't have the right to be imprecise. We don't have the right to flatten cities. But let's take Hamas's death toll, right? If Hamas's death toll is correct, and there's 10,000 dead, or I think it's at 11,000 even, 0% of them are Hamas, by the way. There's 0 Hamas dead. Let's you and I imagine, for the purposes of discussion, that there's 3,000 Hamas dead. That's maybe it's 2,000. There's quite a bit of Hamas fighters killed. In a population, in one of the densest populated places on Earth, with I think we've hit 12,000 strikes. That's a very low death toll. It's not a low death toll in terms of human suffering, but it's a low death toll in terms of the question, is the Israeli Air Force aiming, or is it firing indiscriminately? So we have not yet seen a clear case that isn't moral panic, a moral panic deployed on us that isn't deployed by American academics and researchers, even on America's own forces. Folks, America bombed the maternity hospital in Baghdad in 2003 in its invasion of Baghdad. America bombed hospitals in Afghanistan. It's give us the argument that this is a war crime beyond what the American military itself has done over the decades, or any military that's faced any kind of, go to Fallujah in Iraq, that kind of counterinsurgency operation. Mosul is 9 months, tens of thousands of dead. Talk to us about what the laws of war are in this actual conflict without just talking to us about your own moral panic. And you might be able to make a case that the Israeli army has to fundamentally change how it operates. But we haven't heard that case yet. And so I think Israelis think that Hamas is responsible for it, that it is a vast atrocity. What it did to Israel is a reason it must be destroyed. And what it's doing to the Palestinians in Gaza is a reason it must be destroyed. Most Israelis are not Daniela Weiss. They have no designs on Gaza. I don't know if people know, but Gaza is not the land of Israel by the definitions of Jewish religious belief and history and law. In other words, in the land of Israel, the laws of Shemitah apply, which is to say every 7th year, the land has to lie fallow. There are all these laws of agriculture that apply in the land of Israel and don't apply outside the land of Israel in the Bible, biblical laws and Jewish laws. And they affect, some years I have to buy avocados from Mexico. You know, they have slight effect on my life. They don't apply to Gaza. Those laws, Gaza is, there isn't an Israeli sense. By the way, in the West Bank, it's a whole different story. The entire Bible happens in the West Bank. Gaza is not a place that Israeli society has designs on or a desire for. It is about Hamas. And the fact that for Israelis it's about Hamas, I'm sorry, I'll finish, I'm sorry, I apologize, is why...
No, I want to get one last question in. So
is why the support is so vast. From the deep progressive Israeli left to the farthest extreme of the Israeli right, there is unity of purpose that we have never in the history of Israel seen on anything. And the reason is that the war effort really is focused on Hamas.
Last question, I want to zoom out. Iran, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Hamas, the rhetoric is of the colonist Zionists, which of course echoes a certain Western academic rhetoric of settler colonialism. We're hearing that in a speech that Raisi just gave today. What's wrong with that in terms of, I'm not asking to frame the whole situation, but in terms of thinking about this war and analyzing it to Algeria, where the notion was if we just inflict enough pain on the French, they'll leave.
Yeah, I love the fluidity of the Iranian regime's ideology. They talk about Islamic conquest of the world one day, and then they talk about George Floyd the next. This sense that there's a lot of value in somehow intertwining their vision of Islamic renewal and triumphalism with Western progressive ideas and language. The decolonization argument is a problem, not for Israel. It is, in fact, a major force multiplier for Israel over the decades. The Palestinians have believed profoundly, Palestinians, I mean Palestinian ideological elites, people who also are the founders of Fatah and Hamas and other organizations, have believed in the decolonization paradigm basically ever since Algeria. In 1962, the Algerians kicked the French out after a brutal 8-year war. And in 1964, 3 years before the beginning of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the Palestinians found the PLO modeled on, the Palestine Liberation Organization modeled on the French, the Algerian National Liberation Front. And the idea is that, the French were in Algeria 130 years. There were 1.5 million French citizens in Algeria. The Jews, there are many of them. They've been here a long time, but that doesn't mean you can't kick them out, just like they kicked them out of Algeria. Similar kinds of ideas coming from Kenya, similar where the British were kicked out, and the Mau Mau Rebellion, and Southern Africa, and all these other places. Basically, the problem with this idea isn't that, we feel like we're a native people. Our narrative is that we're home. If you come to me and say you're an evil colonialist, go home, my problem is, where is that? By the way, I happen to be pretty much 100% Ashkenazi, but I'm weird in that I don't have many neighbors who are 100% Ashkenazi. I have neighbors who are half Moroccan, half Yemeni, half Polish, half Iraqi. Where are they going to go home? The foundation of the violent anti-colonial concept, strategic concept, never mind morality, the strategic concept, its foundation is that the colonialist is in your land for some benefit. And if you give that benefit the value of X, the anti-colonial strategy of organizations like the FLN in Algeria was very, very simple. If I raise the cost to X plus 1, the colonialist leaves. But that depends on knowing what X is. It depends on knowing what the colonialist perceives the benefit to be. If the benefit is the glory of empire or geography or silver mines or any kind of classical imperialist or colonialist benefit that drove these phenomena in the 20th century, in the 19th and 20th centuries, then there is an amount of pain I can inflict that will kick them out. I will start murdering their children, and pretty soon they're not going to want to stay. The problem with us isn't that we have a story that we belong. It's that we have nowhere to go. We arrived in this land as refugees. People don't know our story. We're not good at telling it because we're Zionists who don't believe we have to justify ourselves to anyone. So we have a culture that's bad at telling our story. But our story is that just about all of us came here from somewhere where we couldn't stay. Half of us come from the Arab world. The Arab world emptied out of its Jews completely. In 1930, I think Baghdad was 25% Jewish. By 1952, Baghdad is 0% Jewish. All the Jews have left. And they left because of a regime that was the Ali Rashid regime. Folks, look it up. Basically, a profoundly pro-Nazi regime, but also ideologically an anti-Semitic regime. And they flee. And they arrive here, and they have nowhere to go back to. And so the Palestinian investment in us, vision of us, interpretation of us as a colonialist phenomenon, has driven the Palestinians to an FLN strategy. Palestinians are not cruel. They are not stupid. They are not incompetent. They are not any of the things that some of their critics say about them when they see a massacre like October 7th, right? There was the old French diplomat in the Napoleonic Wars. Napoleon killed some member of the royal family, and Talleyrand was his name. He said it was worse than a crime. It was a mistake. Right? The problem with October 7th strategically, right? The big question that people need to ask Palestinians about October 7th is, what the hell were you thinking? What did you think this was gonna, was this, right? Time after time after time, this terrorism is directed at Israelis. And by the way, right now it's directed at Israelis when Israel is led by the most right-wing government in its history. But the second intifada was a wave of 140 suicide bombings that shattered the Israeli left, beginning in the autumn of 2000, at the height of the peace process. This terrorism comes when there's peace. This terrorism, when the peace is imminent, we are told by our leaders, their leaders. And the terrorism comes when the peace is completely stalled and settlements are growing. And so Israelis don't believe that the Palestinian terrorism ever stops, and don't trust Palestinian politics. Long story short, the anti-colonial paradigm is a paradigm that Israelis cannot fulfill. It casts us in a role that fits the moral cartoons running in the Western academic discourse. But if you don't know where we're going to go, you are not going to satisfy, right? There's a debate between Rashida Tlaib and pro-Israel activists in America, but it's not really that. It's really between Congresswoman Rashida Tlaib and Hamas, because the debate is over what the phrase "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free" actually means. Where Congresswoman Tlaib says it means from the river to the sea, there will be a kind of American-style civic democracy where everybody just gets a vote. The problem is that in Arabic, when Hamas chants that phrase, it's from the river to the sea, Palestine will be Arab, not free. And that's not a civic democracy. That's a place without Jews. And so we don't have the ability to fulfill that request. Iran believes that if it can torment us long enough, first the elites leave, they talk about this openly, then the rest of Israelis leave, we have nowhere to go. Violence like October 7th, like the Second Intifada, like the terror violence that had the same basic organizing theory in the 1920s has always driven the Palestinian cause into a brick wall. And I think we need a new Palestinian paradigm of us, a new Palestinian interpretation of us that understands us better.
Okay, Haviv, thank you so much for being with us. We touched on so many things, and it was great to hear the sights from where you are. We hope that you're well, and we look forward to being back with you after the new year at the beginning of spring semester, and hopefully we'll be in a more peaceful position. Thank you all for coming. Thank you all for your support of the Diller Institute. Take care.